Welcome to Thinking Class, Lionel. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Excellent. Wow. It's great to have you on the show, having read so much of your direct, unflinching and humorous columns over the years. I first came across you in the Spectator when I started reading it many years ago, and an apology since. And I know you tend to write your columns now from the sunny climes of Portugal, now that you have absconded from Britain after 36 years here, which is much to our detriment. Lionel, why did you leave us? What changed?
Big sigh. Before we get into that, I have to clarify that it was difficult for me, and I think I've got over it, but there's still a little residue of shame. That is, it makes me feel weirdly guilty, as if it's a betrayal of some sort. Now, I'm not saying that there's this whole crowd of people who is clamoring for my head because they wanted so badly for me to stay in the UK. I realize most people don't give a toss. But I have formed an emotional attachment to the UK. It's hard not to, living that long. And therefore I care what happens to it. But I'm not sure that, given the kind of future I see for the country, I want to be a part of that, and I don't have to. There's a point at which I can take advantage of the fact that I am still an American, and however emotionally involved I may be in the fate of the UK, I am not attached in the same way as you are, for example. And but I wanted to clarify that it still hurt. I miss my friends and my colleagues. There have been considerable opportunity costs to not being present, especially in London, when events come along, or parties, or various invitations to appear that aren't quite worth, the plane journey and all the faff. I'm coming over a little less often than I expected, just because, flying is annoying.
Yeah.
So, and very time consuming, even if it's not a long flight. So this has entailed some sacrifice. But there are, as for why leave, there are a host of reasons, and they kind of glom together into one big dark feeling. The crime situation is not good. The crime situation was certainly not good in my immediate neighborhood. I was living in the butt end of Bermondsey. The only social media I subscribe to is this next door thing, which is about what's happening in my immediate neighborhood. And I still get their emails, and virtually every single one of them is about theft, theft or occasional violence. And that is a strain to put on yourself, even when you don't happen to be robbed. You always could be, and you've got to be very careful. One of the main reasons we had to have house sitters over the summer when we were away in New York was because it was too dangerous to have the property unoccupied. So, that's under-thrilling. And then what's happened to the Met is under-thrilling, because they've become so woked out that the only thing they seem to be especially exercised about is misgendering. And therefore their clearance rate on real crime is appalling. It's around 5% on most significant crimes. That's just one element. I'm very distressed about the net zero situation, which connects up with a larger problem of incompetent amateur governance, so that you have people passing these stupid laws that are completely impractical. And the people who have passed them don't know what they're doing, don't have any idea of what the implications are, and all they care is how it looks. You know, it's legislation as posturing, and that's what this net zero thing is. Even if it were completely successful, it would make no difference to the temperature of the planet. I mean, even if you buy the whole climate change narrative, which increasingly I sort of don't. It wouldn't, 1% of the CO2 emissions of the planet, meaningless. So all it is showing off to no effect. And meanwhile, and this is a problem of 25 years in the making, there are no plans for the provision of enough energy for the country, and that we're already at, I can't help but still say we.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep saying we. We're already at the point where energy companies are paying customers to not use appliances during peak hours. Yeah. That was even the case this last winter, and it was a really mild winter. So, and meanwhile, we're letting all those power plants go offline and not building any new ones and expecting to make up the difference with windmills and solar panels. I mean, it's absurd. And, maybe the government, when it becomes real enough, will pull back on all this nonsense. But in the meantime, it's costing a lot of money, and there's going to be a significant shortfall of energy provision. I mean, the absurdity of it just blows your mind. They want everyone to heat their homes with electricity and to drive an electric car, and at the same time, they don't have any electricity. I mean, you'd have to be younger than 3 to not figure out there's a problem here. So, gosh, what else? The immigration situation.
Before we jump into immigration, on the energy point, so I've been having a bit of an ongoing conversation with a friend of mine who is a head of sustainability at a financial services firm, and generally just jousting with each other on the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of this. And one of the things that he shared with me, presented as a win, which in some ways it is, but it also had a big drawback, was this graph produced by an organization, pro-renewable, within the EU, to show the changing energy mix that was used by homes or countries within the EU. And it shows that there's been this big replacement of what I suppose the traditional sources of fuel that are reputationally unpopular, at least within the chattering classes, but actually are very popular for usage. And so you can see that change. It's quite clear, but basically it's presented in such a way that shows the amount of terawatts per hour that the fuel sources use on either side. And what you can see really is that now, over the course of that time, that changing energy mix, that there's a 25% decrease in energy output, kind of roughly, but if you can see it. And so there seems to be a basic supply and demand here, which is, if you do have less energy, and obviously in the case of the UK, whilst I've just talked about EU data, but let's just say there's a similar situation going on there. But then we're actually a country, and I know you're about to get into immigration, that's going to go through rapid population growth. Everyone's already suffering from high energy bills. Feasibly, that's only going to go higher. So just besides the fact it's going to cost an awful lot of money to change the energy grid and all of those things, I think you are right. There's an operationalizing of it that is just a huge undertaking, and I'm not too sure any of that's really been taken into account properly. It has just become let's get things down on paper and enshrined in law, and we'll kind of hope for the best. Maybe I've been unfair there, but that's how it seems.
No, you're not being unfair. That is what's going on. It's like, technology will solve everything. Mm. It's like belief in fairies.
Yeah.
You do not pass legislation requiring people to use something that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, I know that's the point that John Gray, the political philosopher, makes. He says that net zero is the politics of narcissism because we've gone and made all of these time-stamped goals without having the means in which to deliver them yet, and hoping that some of those things get developed over time. And there are many people who disagree with that and say, well, we can't just expect other countries to, we can't expect ourselves to not partake in it because we might not make much of a difference. But I think the argument I suppose I try and make with folks who take that line, which is we can't base our ethical framework on we'll do it if you do it. But I think we do need to take into account that there are many more populous regions and heavily polluting regions now that just dwarfs anything that Europe and the UK will do. And so if we are feeling like we're on a path to impoverishing ourselves and the vast majority of people, and I think an Unheard report's just come out this week, which relies on some research from some of the universities saying that 40% of UK households are on the verge of energy poverty because of the rising prices, which are only forecast to go up. So, we have to ask ourselves, why have we ratcheted ourselves into this when we could go at a pace, if we are committed to it, that doesn't bankrupt the nation's finances and people at the same time.
Well, I will say that even if you just throw the climate change thing out the window, it is necessary to eventually get off fossil fuels in majority because we have already used up the easily accessible sources of fossil fuels, and it's getting much more expensive to get it out of the ground. And that's the case, whatever. But that doesn't mean that there's certainly enough leeway to make that transition in a considered, intelligent, well-researched way that doesn't disrupt your society. I mean, there's enough time, there's enough fossil fuels left that we can make that transition gracefully. What we're setting up right now is to do it haphazardly without any consideration for the practicalities. And in the UK's case, we're not talking about, 2050, 2060. We're talking about in the next few years. I mean, we're talking about right now. And I don't want to live in a dysfunctional country. And the larger issue is that the UK is increasingly a dysfunctional country on many different levels. And, the NHS is a mess. It's not going to get any better. It's probably got some serious design flaws. It's too centralized. It's too bureaucratic. But there seems to be very little appetite anywhere to make the kind of changes that would make the service sustainable and really serve the people it's supposed to help. And even the private sector is under strain. Of course, it's often a lot the same doctors. Because now so many more people are using private health insurance. So that means, I ended up getting private health insurance eventually because it seemed to me it was a necessity, which I found disheartening because I like the idea of a national health service.
I agree on that point, actually, because I've used it when I was given it as a benefit within my job in the past. And I thought, I'm not going to use it. I'll just use the NHS. But then I needed some specialist treatment and used it. And I was surprised how quick it enabled me to access services. But that was 7 years ago. I'm going through something similar now. And you just got to wait 3 months for an appointment. It's almost...
the situation, there's a huge knock-on effect with the private health insurance. And it used to be that because even people who had private health insurance mostly they used the NHS, and then only went to use their private providers for particular instances. That's no longer the case. And that means that private health insurance is increasingly functioning like the NHS. So it just means that overall, the standard of healthcare available in the UK is poor, and that's for everybody. I mean, I guess that would make some more socialists happy because everyone gets shit health insurance. You can't buy your way out of it.
Well, we are moving at a canter through the big problems of Britain. I think before we went off on a bit of a tangent on net zero and climate change policies, you're about to start talking about immigration.
Immigration. Well, I know this is a touchy subject, but it's also one of my favorite subjects. And, London is geographically in England, but that's about the end of it. I think the white British population is now down to something like 37%.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think
it's probably lower now. And I was basically living in little Nigeria. And nothing against Nigeria in Nigeria. But I wasn't functionally living in England. And my neighborhood was a heavily council-owned area, and it had hugely transformed before I got there. But even while I was living there, I lived there for 13 years, it transformed even more. I mean, it was just all immigrants. And it used to be a white working class area, which was very mutually supportive. And I mean, I heard stories about how people used to leave their doors open, and everyone knew everyone else. That was already way gone by the time I arrived, but the complete takeover of social housing by people who weren't born in Britain and had not contributed anything to the system was annoying. I have to say, it was actively annoying. I mean, I'm also an immigrant, yes, but I've never been a burden on the state. I've never used social housing, and I'm paying for these people. I'm paying taxes. I'm paying council tax, and they're not. And I don't like that atmosphere of being in a place that's being taken advantage of. It was a very strong feeling in where I was living, that these people are takers. Mm. And one of the reasons they were here is to take. And you feel like the authorities are mugs, and the people who are paying the price are regular taxpayers who have very poor services, and apropos of the NHS, etc. And it's a creepy feeling. It's a bad emotional and political environment to live in, to feel that that you're surrounded by people who are taking advantage of other people's goodwill.
I think the issue you just highlighted is definitely that hot button topic that is not going to go away in British politics for decades. And one thing that makes me question the idea that Gen Z, for example, are certainly heading towards an inexorable liberal worldview, I'm starting to buy less and less. So when I started this podcast, I had to go on Twitter so I could promote it. and someone that I came across who has been getting an awful lot of traction in such a short period of time is a chap in his early 20s. I think, judging by his accent, he could be from the Potteries or what have you. But he has been creating micro content, which 60 seconds to 90 seconds, and it's just full of data. And all of it is around the unfairness he feels as a university graduate, heavily indebted, having moved to London. Mm-hmm. He's paying £2,000 a month to live in a flat, and that's to be in a shared flat. And he has noticed that his neighbours are in social housing in the same block of flats, and they are foreign nationals. And he's pulling out data saying 47% of social housing in London is taken by foreign nationals, people who've come here and thus not paid into the system. And the crux of all of his messages
is that
unfair.
Number will just go up, right? Because the people hanging on to their housing, if they ever, let's be candid, the white people who have social housing, if they die, it'll go to an immigrant. That's just the way the system works right now.
Yeah, well, if you look at the figures from the Office for National Statistics, which I think Matt Goodwin, also political commentator, has been popularising of late, he's someone who, like you, says that people don't like to talk about immigration, but it's one of his favourite topics too, but not because he particularly enjoys it, it's because of all of those issues that come with it if not managed correctly. He has shared some data that says that during the period between mid-2021 and mid-2036, the ONS projections suggest that 13.7 million people will immigrate long-term to the UK. The population right now is 67 million. The population by then will be 74 million. And obviously that's an increase of 7, but we're getting 14 million more, which means 7 million are leaving. And that's quite interesting. I think we talk a lot about immigration and pace of change. They're always net migration figures, and we've got people going out the other way, and they're not coming back.
There's a reason they quote net. There's a reason, because it makes it smaller.
Yeah.
Was it 2022 that the net was 745,000? But the fact is that they issued 1.2 million visas, right? So, and a large proportion of the people who leave are native-born Brits. So the demographic transformation, the ethnic transformation, is much more drastic than even the appalling net figures suggest. And I follow this issue quite closely. I sense an enormous pent-up rage in the UK population, and they feel completely helpless, and that this is being imposed on them, and they don't know whom to vote for. I mean, there's reform, which isn't really right now electorally practical. You're not going to get anybody into Parliament, so what's the point? I'm very sympathetic with that sense of outrage, because it is really straining public services. The Tories have lied as to what they were going to do, and they, rather than tighten up immigration, Boris Johnson loosened it, made it a lot easier to come into the country. The Home Office is woke out of its mind, and obviously motivated to let as many people into the country as possible. And the UK doesn't have the resources. The services, public services, are already under enormous strain. The housing situation is out of control. It's almost wholly because of immigration. And I actually don't, I've puzzled on this. I don't know why it's not 100% over it's why population growth is not 100% immigration, because the UK has had a below replacement rate birth rate for 50 years. So where's the growth coming from if it's not coming from outside the country?
Well, those figures that we ran through before apparently is suggesting that the population growth to be felt between now and 2036, 92% of it will be made up purely of immigrants.
So I'm just saying, I have no idea what the other 8% is.
Yes.
I just don't get it.
Yeah.
I'm interested in demography, so I've puzzled on this for quite some time.
Yeah.
But this is not anything that anyone asked for, and it is a net economic deficit. It's just because the UK is letting in low-skill, poorly educated people who also bring in their often non-working relatives, and then if they do get any money, they send it all home. So there's been research recently. I'm trying to remember whether it was Denmark or the Netherlands. I think it was the Netherlands that broke down what the net lifetime fiscal effect on the country was of different groups, because we tend to put all the immigrants together and they're not all the same. So if I may defend my own peripatetics, if you let in Americans or Canadians, or even, just white British, Australians, they are an enormous net benefit over their lifetime. And I mean something like up to 600,000 euros. And that's a lot. But the trouble is that if you look at other groups like Sub-Saharan Africa, it's the same amount of money in the negative. And since we are looking at increasing population pressure from Sub-Saharan Africa, because that's where all the population growth is, that matters. That matters a lot. So, but there is no effort in the UK, despite all the rhetoric, to become truly picky about whom you let in, and making sure that you bring in people who are a net economic benefit, not to mention a net cultural benefit to your country. And this isn't just a UK problem, obviously, and it's even worse in the United States right now. It's appalling in the United States. If you just look at these pictures of thousands and thousands of people coming in every day through little holes in the border, and they're just, rubber stamped into the country. So don't get me started on that one. And I actually mean that. Let's not get started.
We'll put a pin on that one, and we'll stick around the UK's
next year, maybe.
and European nervousness. But I think the nervousness that we've seen of late, certainly there's been a lot more of it post October 7th. I think people generally, regardless of where you sit on that divide, I think people see it as a civilizational moment in some way, because it tells you what's going on. And actually,
you know what? It reminds me. It was a few years ago. There was a huge march. It was probably over this Dreamers issue in the U.S. Whether if you've been brought in as a kid, and therefore it wasn't your fault. If you were, you should be given legal status. And there was this massive march. It was millions of people. And it completely backfired politically. Because it was like, oh my God, look how many of them are there. That is shocking. Because most of the people came out were illegal immigrants. And it visualized what was happening in a way that damaged the cause. And I would say there's a perfect parallel with this, because all these marches in London, and it's not just in London, they're a show of power, right? it is a demonstration of how many people, how many Muslims you have let in with, and here we have very strong feelings. We hate Jews. We want Israel to be wiped from the face of the map, and we will be listened to. And you're not even going to police us, especially, and we get to say whatever hateful things we want because the police are afraid of us. There are too many of us, and you're all afraid of being accused of being Islamophobic. So we can do whatever we want, and we can bring Tower Bridge to a standstill. And you better be, there's an undercurrent of bullying and threat. It's like, you better watch it, right? We're very powerful now. And there's a degree to which we own this country. We certainly own a lot of London. And they want you to be afraid of them. Now, I realize this kind of rhetoric is not fashionable. But I think that's one reason that the conversation about immigration has loosened up a little bit recently, because these shows of power, these shows of force, are making people feel, what have we done?
That straight line you were talking about, connections in people's minds being made. There are some who say that in the Netherlands, when the most recent elections took place, which saw Geert Wilders and his VVD party pick up 36 seats or something, which is the most any party had picked up for a long time. They're always coalitional governments. They've got a different electoral system. But he was polling pre-October 7th to come in still with a majority, but with about 12 seats left. And there are some saying that owing to the demonstrations on the streets that took place in that lead up to the election, that so many more swung his way. And since they've been having similar demonstrations on the streets between, obviously there are Islamists in there, there are obviously going to be hard leftists in there, there are also just going to be, generally well-meaning, decent people in there too that are being swept along in it. They've been happening every week in the Netherlands, and he's failed to form a government yet. People don't want to go near him, as you will well know, as I'm sure many people will know, as if you ever see Geert Wilders referenced in the media, he's like kryptonite. And so there are people even on the right saying, oh, better not form a government with him, that won't look good. But then you go to the polls and go, well, how many would he get if he called an election now? And it's something like 50 seats.
It's even higher.
Yeah, it's even more. And so there is a nervousness.
What percentage? I haven't seen that figure. What percentage is it?
I can't remember what the percentage is, but he got 36 seats in the last election, and he'd be on for 50 seats if it was to be run again.
Wow.
So I think really the civilizational moment that I think people have seen come out to the fore is because we have seen a rise in sectarian politics and a huge divide open up across society. I'll say not just with Muslims, but generally across left and right, and just generally amongst people to go, what's happening here, and that these images do embed in people's minds, as you say, and I suppose this immigration question, which you talked about, the mass immigration, which was part of the reason why you thought of where's Britain going here, is that back to those stats that Matt Goodwin has been popularising recently. A bit of analysis shows that those stats that we're headed for is the equivalent to the 50 years of demographic change that the UK had been through between 1970 and 2020. And it will be in effectively 12 years. So all of these images, all of that nervousness, I can see why you might have pressed the ejector seat, wondering where British politics and that kind of debate might be going and how ugly it might get. Because sitting here right now, it doesn't feel so good. So I have to say there's a pensiveness, and it's not being helped by any of the big parties. And as you said, there's not really a an outlet, an electoral voice for it to go to.
Well, you know, I mean, if you want to get into reason number 4 or something for leaving the UK, it's a pending Labour government. And Labour is not going to do anything about immigration, but you know perfectly well they will only increase it. And you know, I understand why everyone is disillusioned with the Tories. I am too. And they have not governed like small c conservatives remotely on this and many other issues. So there's nowhere to go. And I understand that kind of fatalism that with the traditional conservative base, it's like, this sucks. This is not working. This is not what we asked for. It's not what we voted for. These people are actually acting like they're members of the Labour Party. The trouble is that meanwhile, the Labour has snuck left, and it is going to be worse. It's going to be worse on every front. It'll be worse in terms of environmental, unrealistic, stupid environmental regulation, over regulation in general. The taxes will only get worse. You know, they'll only go in one direction. And the immigration's only going to get worse. So you end up bringing in the other side because there's nobody else to bring in, but it's not going to be for the better.
Yeah, I think Roger Scruton had a term for people who often find themselves in policy-making positions. He said that there are too many unscrupulous optimists, people who believe...
I love that expression.
Yeah, people who believe in a best-case scenario, or there's a utopian scenario, or they have this idea of there are a few different good things over here, and if we just aggregate them all together, that just equals even more goods. So he outlines a whole bunch of fallacies, and effectively he argues in a book which is called The Uses of Pessimism and the Dangers of False Hope that it needs to be counterbalanced with people who can see the trade-offs and the risks, and we can't just go on thinking that we can have this huge vision of this perfect future connected to abstract ideals without recognizing the messiness of local life living together. And I think that connects with another idea of another eminent intellectual, like Thomas Sowell, who talked about where we see a lot of conflict in politics and just in daily life is because there's a conflict of visions. You've got those people who are part of the thinking class. They have the vision of the anointed. They self-anoint themselves. They believe in solutions, the moral perfectibility of man, and that they're just a bit further along that curve. And if you just give them the reins, they'll be able to deliver this perfect plan. And that's another fallacy that Scruton talks about, the planning fallacy, that just follow this plan and things will work out for the best. And that conflicts with the vision most people, ordinary folk, hold, which is the tragic vision is we're not morally perfectible. It's the old story of the fall. You know, we're probably better off relying on cultural and traditional knowledge and norms to help self-govern both as individuals and communities, and not to outsource all of our responsibility. And I suppose this monologue has made me question whether this is just a bit of the end point of liberal governance with regards to, if you just say that all of those constraints and self-governing things and cultures and traditions are kind of oppressive and not to be trusted, and we will, as a government, you can entrust us to enable you to meet your desires in whatever way, just keep on giving us the responsibility to do it. And all of a sudden you've got this big state who looks after every aspect of your lives, and is so insulated from the feelings, the everyday reality of people, and they're sitting in their little offices coming up with these huge plans for a whole society. It's kind of no wonder that it goes wrong. They're blind visionaries that don't even really know how it's going to hit the rest of the nation. And I feel like no matter who you vote for at the moment, whether it's the Tories, whether it's Labour, they're just blind visionaries. They might be slightly oriented in a different direction, but they just believe that they are going to be able to deliver in accordance with this grand plan. And it's failed time and again. And I don't know when we're going to get an option on the table of people who just have a a more realistic view of humanity and what we are and what we can endure, I suppose.
Well, I would say that especially on the left, the commitment is to ideas and not to reality. Ideas trump reality, and therefore success doesn't occur on the ground in people's lives. Success occurs in rhetoric, and those are the kinds of victories they're interested in, and maybe abstractly power, but not making people's real lives better, just a little bit better, not perfect, but making it slightly better, or at least not worse tomorrow, right? And that's where the left has always tended to fall down. Is traditionally they have an overly optimistic, as you were saying, view of human nature, and imagine that we're all perfectible. In fact, one of the things that actually changed on the left in the last few years with the new woke cancel culture people, they actually think we're all evil. And that's that kind of cynicism about, at least all white people are irremediable racists, right? That's not the kind of view that a traditional left wing usually embraced. The usual problem is that they have too cheerful a version of people, and therefore aren't looking out for how much, for example, people will take advantage of the welfare system because they don't want to work. It's just assumed that everyone wants to work and they're good. And if you take advantage, if you use the welfare system, it's because, you have a good reason. You can't work. But nowadays, I think the left is much darker on human nature, and it therefore is much more oriented toward control, toward authoritarianism. You have to make people be good. You have to bring in laws, and basically the police make people be good. And that is, that is therefore assuming that people won't do what you regard as the right thing naturally. And that was on display during COVID, which was another, by the way, turnoff for me about the UK. I never felt the same way about the UK after COVID. And it was, all the other pandemics previous, it was like, everyone was trusted to protect themselves. And if you were especially vulnerable to a disease that most people would survive, you were trusted to stay home or not do too much socializing because you would act naturally in your own self-interest. But as far as when COVID came along, that was out the window, and nobody could be trusted to be intelligent and act on their own behalf, and everyone had to be perfectly controlled down to the point of absurdity. And I think that was more cynicism. People are stupid is the assumption.
Well, we've definitely taken the black pill, to use internet parlance, a few times today, and I'll continue with that until potentially offering an avenue of hope, or at least we can engage in our own envisioning of a future. Andrew Neil posted on Twitter in the last 24 hours the following, which I think sums up some of the things that we've been talking about. It would be good to get your take on it and see whether you agree with it. And then I got a question for you as well. So Andrew Neil says, the UK is drifting, unhappy, losing faith in previously respected institutions like the police, buffeted by extremists, often allowed to run amok. dismayed by decline, angry at the inability of the political class to do anything about it, despairing that the Westminster Politico media bubble pursues an agenda, issues and priorities, look at the obsession with Lee Anderson, which are not most people's, and had enough of being lectured to by a disconnected, de haut en bas, chattering class. Yet we have a Prime Minister and leader of the opposition incapable of speaking up for the moderate majority, who still have pride in their country and are desperate for strong leadership and guidance through the current morass, plus some hope sign things will get better. All within the bounds of traditional British tolerance and fair play. This vacuum is dangerous. I'm guessing from some of the things we've talked about, you would agree with Andrew. But Lionel, if the country could ever win you back as a resident, what would it need you to do? What would you need to see?
I'd love to see another party come along. I mean, I think both major parties are dysfunctional. I would say the same thing of the United States. They are disconnected from what people want. And, both parties are to the left of the majority of the population, which is bizarre. I'd certainly like to see a little more functionality, which would include clapping down on immigration and keeping it under 100,000 a year. That will never happen. That means I'm never going back, I guess. And I'd love to see all the woke stuff just go out the window. I mean, part of the embarrassment of that movement in the UK is that you guys didn't even make it up, right? This is all imitative of American insanity. And if you're going to imitate anything from the United States, the last thing you want to bring in is this drecky, destructive, self-hating ideology. I mean, it's poison, and it has infected all the UK major institutions as badly as it's infected the US ones. And I think it's shameful, and it does. It makes the UK a more depressing place to live for everyone. I mean, is this? I'm not usually big on vocal patriotism, but that's because I grew up in a time in my country where there was lots of patriotism, and therefore nobody needed my patriotism, if you know what I mean. I'm not really into ceremonies. In the UK, I'm not that big on the royal family. I think it plays an important social role, but I don't show up for all those occasions and wave flags. It's just, I don't like pomp. It bores me. Nevertheless, when I was growing up, it was normal to be patriotic as an American. And that freed me to be very critical of the United States, because it was a minority viewpoint, and it was trendy. But, there was this sense that otherwise, in terms of people generally believing in the country as a project, that was not endangered. So I could poke at it and be very outright anti-American if I wanted to, but that didn't endanger anything. There was still basically a sense that there was a rock solid self-belief in the country, so that I was indulging in what we now call luxury beliefs, right? I had luxury anti-patriotism as an adolescent. We can't afford it anymore. Those luxury beliefs are now institutionalized. They are now mainstream. It is now mainstream to hate your country, to be ashamed of your country. And it's even becoming mainstream to regard it as in a terminal decline. And I'm afraid I'm feeding that right now. And I don't feel entirely good about that, because I do think there's still such a thing as British culture, and some of my best friends are British. So I feel a little guilty doing the country down too much, and I have regard for it. I have regard for British history, for British cultural achievements, the British sense of humor. I like Britain. I don't want it to go swirling down the toilet. But I hate seeing it go dark, so dark about itself, and become fatalistic in a really saddening way. That I guess that's all over now, and we have to resign ourselves. Native Britons have to resign themselves that they're going to be a minority in what was once their own country in short order, and that's kind of, oh well. And there's always been a strain of British culture, especially at the top intellectual level, that did the country down. And it's never been especially cool to be patriotic. And while in my decrepitude, I'm starting to see there's a place for patriotism. After all, if you're not a patriot, you don't die for your country. You just don't. And in both the US and UK, I think we've got a majority younger generations who would not go to war. They just wouldn't. And that's shocking. There are polls that back this up.
Yeah, you are right.
And after all, the UK has to thank many young people, mostly young men, who gave their lives in World War II for the fact that the UK really still exists. And you can't just assume that will never happen again.
I suppose that's the shocking thing, right? Is you can get so close to a civilizational collapse, however it is that you want to term it, with regards to the various different angles we could be facing into that now, and yet have it almost disappear from collective memory to the point where we feel like there's not so much worth fighting for now, or we just take it for granted. I think is the other thing, is there's a complacency. I mean, there's also lots of people that I speak to across the divide, the political divide, who just think, well, things will turn out all right in the end. But there are so few people willing to play their part in things being all right in the end, on whatever level and whatever issue that they care about. It's just a kind of a blind faith, I suppose. And I guess that gets us, it ties in a little bit with that unscrupulous optimist points a bit. It's just this hope that the best case
everything will be fine.
Will turn out.
Oh, I actually gave a whole lecture in 2020 about this issue of complacency, because I believe the left in general right now is complacent. That is, they think that you can hack at a civilization as much as you want and everything will still be fine. Most of these people do not imagine that their politics endanger their iPhone updates. All that's going to carry on. And they're going to go to the supermarket and they're going to get their frozen dim sum or whatever. And everything's going to be completely available and they can get their vegan milk and whatever. They don't actually expect to make any sacrifices for whatever revolution they're rooting for. A lot of these people are white, and they think that if they bring in radical affirmative action policies, that of course they're going to be hired because they're good. No, if you're going to bring in radical overcompensatory racial quotas and you're white and that means you're out, then you're probably going to be one of the people who's out of a job or who doesn't get into university. You know, there's no appreciation on the left that even their own personal day-to-day security, the way they go through their lives, there's no appreciation for the fact that the kind of policies they're advocating, the kind of disruption that they're coveting would destroy that life. They think they can be as disruptive as they want and bring in whatever policies they want, and everything will still be fine, and everything will take over the way it always has been, supermarkets, iPhone updates, etc. And it was especially when I wrote The Mandibles, which came out in 2016, which is about the failure of the dollar in the United States and therefore what happens. I came to an appreciation for the horrifying fragility of order. And it's order that's a miracle, right? The natural state of nature is chaos. And that's true of our species also. It doesn't take much before basically you're running in packs and ripping each other's throats out. I mean, it's civilization is improbable, and we should be grateful for it. And it therefore requires protection and shepherding, and that also means not tearing it all apart because it's not perfect in your terms. It means being careful, and it means appreciating what you have inherited. And education is now so poor that we have raised generations that don't know anything and therefore don't appreciate how far we've come and how much better they've got it than their forebears. And they also don't appreciate the fragility of the future. And it's all of our responsibility who are alive at this time. There's nobody else to do it. Nobody. We belong to a particular set of people who is responsible for carrying the past into the future. Nobody else can do it. The other people are dead now. And I mean, I try to do my small part, to remind people to be responsible, if only by writing horror stories about what happens when you're not.
Well, I think that's our crumb of hope, the exhortation that people ought to pick up the torch, as it were, that we should recognize that what we have is not self-evident, whether it's rights, whether it's the freedoms that we had, whether it's this materially abundant society, and that if we want any of it to continue on into the future, or if we want anything that is recognizably home, that we need to make sacrifices for that personal, for the collective, I suppose. And yeah, that idea that there's a democracy of the dead here, that we are linked to people in the past, and they've figured stuff out long before we did, and it might not have an answer in a textbook, but what we're living through is deeply improbable based on human history. So there's that crumb of hope. I'm gonna grab onto that while I can, Lionel, because I think both you and I have the propensity to take us
Talking
down.
definitely.
Still talking definitely, and take us down to a very dark place. Thank you so much for joining me, Lionel. I know you're not on social media. However, for anyone who's interested in following you and seeing what you're up to, what publications are you writing in regularly these days?
Well, I have had a fortnightly column in the Spectator since 2017, and I'm still plugging along. The improved view out my window in Portugal doesn't seem to have reduced my bitterness and bile and fortunately also sense of humor. So you can always keep up with that. I've got a new novel coming out in April called Mania, which I think is a lot of fun. Okay. It's set in the near past, and it suddenly seizes the Western world that there is no such thing as variable human intelligence, i.e., there is no such thing as stupid, which becomes, the S word you can never utter, and this great leveling. Well, let's just say it doesn't have a healthy effect on society, and yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'm working on a new book which we will not talk about.
Okay, well, to be revealed, I suppose. Keep an eye out for Mania. I'll keep reading you in the Spectator. Hope to be able to speak to you again in the future, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'd enjoy that.
Great. Well, enjoy Portugal. Right. Until next time.
Till next time, then.
Take care, Lionel. Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @Thinking Class and follow me on X @Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.